In 476, a 22-year-old emperor ate something sent from the palace of the woman he called Mother. 3 days later, he was dead. She had raised him since childhood. She taught him whom to trust, how to answer, and when to stay silent. But she was not his birth mother. She had never given birth to a son. And yet, emperors kept falling into her hands, one after another. Her name was Feng. The court called her civilized. The emperors learned something else. A woman with no son had found the one role no emperor could easily destroy: mother. And before she ever ruled from behind a curtain, she learned how to survive by watching who everyone feared. Only then does her background matter. Feng came from a fallen imperial house. Her grandfather had once been an emperor. Her father served the conquerors, then was executed by them. In the palace corridor, Feng kept her head down and counted the feet that stopped in front of her. She watched who entered first, who stepped aside, and whose voice could make everyone stop talking. At 14, she was chosen for Emperor Wenqing and tested before the court. A future empress had to cast a golden figure. If it cracked, heaven had rejected her. The records do not tell us every detail of Feng's test. They tell us the result. At 15, she became empress. Then her husband, Emperor Wenqing, died. The powerful minister Yi Hun seized the government and began killing officials to make the court afraid. Yi Hun thought fear made him untouchable. Feng saw the families he had turned against him. Within months, Yi Hun was arrested and executed. Feng did not need to look strong. She needed his victims to move together. She had survived by looking harmless. Now she had learned how to kill a giant without standing in front of him. Northern Wei had a brutal rule. When a prince became heir, his birth mother was executed. Most people saw terror. Feng saw the empty place it left beside the child. She convinced everyone that she should handle the child's daily life and raise him until he was grown. That meant more than feeding him or holding him. It meant deciding who entered his room, whose voice he heard first, and whose hands he learned to reach for. The first child was Xianwen. Feng began raising him before he understood what a throne was. She changed the people around him. A child that young does not understand politics, but he understands warmth, fear, hunger, and the person everyone looks at before they move. Before he met ministers, he looked to her. Before he learned command, he learned permission. Years later, Xianwen's own son became heir. This time, no one needed to be persuaded. The nurse, the tutor, the servants, the rewards, the punishments, all passed through Feng. If Xiaowen was praised, he knew who allowed it. If someone vanished from his side, he learned not to ask why. Feng was not simply raising a child. She was building the first rules of his world. By the third succession, the palace knew the route. Motherless emperors went to Feng. She never gave birth to an emperor. She built the childhood every emperor had to experience. But a child raised inside her hand would not stay small forever. Emperor Xianwen became the first child Feng raised who tried to rule without looking back at her. He sat on the throne, but ministers still waited for the curtain. That was what he wanted to break. He reopened old cases and cleared people caught in the purge under the rebel minister Yi Hun. He was learning Feng's own weapon. Make the court believe you are justice. Then Xianwen struck the place Feng had kept most private. He targeted Feng's lover, Li Yi. Li Yi was charged with corruption and executed. The charge mattered less than the message. Xianwen was telling her, "I can touch the person you kept outside politics. I am no longer afraid of you." Feng did not scream. If she screamed, it became scandal. If she struck too soon, it looked like revenge for a lover. So she went quiet. Messages slowed. Guards changed. Officials began waiting to see which way her curtain moved. Xianwen began to feel the trap. Nothing looked like rebellion, but everything stopped obeying him. He abdicated to his 4-year-old son, but kept power as retired emperor. He thought stepping away from the throne would make him safer. Feng saw the opening. He was no longer the sitting emperor, but he was still dangerous. In 476, Jianwen died at 22. Some sources say poisoned wine, others give a different method. What no one could prove was who gave the order. He had killed the man she cared about. After his death, Feng returned to power. Feng's next emperor was Xiaowen, the grandson she had raised from infancy. At first, his intelligence pleased her. Then it frightened her. He remembered officials. He answered ministers directly. He began building loyalties that did not pass through her. A minister who received an answer from Xiaowen did not need to wait for Feng's face. A servant who carried his words began carrying his authority too. Feng had wanted a brilliant tool. What stood before her was becoming a real emperor. To her, this was not a child growing up. It was power leaving her hands and learning to speak in his voice. She had seen this pattern once before with Shanwen. A boy she raised became a man who no longer looked back. Around 483, she had Xiaowen confined, not scolded, contained. She considered replacing him with a younger brother, a boy still small enough to shape without resistance. The ministers did not beg her heart. They spoke to her calculation. Removing Xiaowen could split the court. So Xiaowen lived, not because Feng had forgotten how to destroy a son, but because this son was still useful alive. He survived, but the old bond did not. From then on, both of them knew what she had almost done. Feng spent her life making emperors unable to live without her. At the end, she chose to stay far away from everyone. Years before her death, she chose Fengshen and ordered her own tomb built there. The court would have placed her beside Emperor Wenqing, the husband whose funeral fire she once entered. Feng refused. No official record explains why. Feng died in 490 at 49. Emperor Xiaowen refused food for 5 days, then mourned her for 3 years. He mourned the woman who raised him, ruled him, terrified him, and almost replaced him. History called her the civilized Empress Dowager. Through her own ability, she abolished an old system and changed the direction of a dynasty. Everyone had needed her. But the grave she chose needed no one.